Hello, it has been a while since I recorded a video, and this evening I'm recording another video on mental health awareness during this month of May, which is celebrated for mental awareness. As I always say, my videos are made under the program Ogewe Bere ya Hinya, that knowledge is beyond strength, and he or she who has knowledge has strength with that can enable them do a lot of things. So in this program of I'm going to redefine the frontier of mental health awareness. You are all welcome to listen to it. May marks the annual observance of Mental Health Awareness Month, a period traditionally dedicated to elevating public consciousness, dismantling age-old stigmas, and fostering empathy for those navigating the turbulent waters of psychological distress. Historically, these campaigns have focused on clinical literacy. They teach communities to recognize the diagnostic markers of major depressive disorders, generalized anxiety disorder, bipolar spectrum conditions, schizophrenia, and various personality disorders. Concurrently, they illuminate the dark corners of substance use disorders, tracing the destructive trajectories of alcohol dependency, prescription drugs misuse, marijuana abuse, and illicit stimulants like cocaine. Yet, as the global conversations around mental wellness matures, a profound and troubling disconnect has emerged. The dominant framework of modern psychology and psychiatry remains stubbornly hyper-individualized. It operates almost exclusively at the micro level, the internal mechanics of the individual mind, and the meso level, the immediate social ecology, including dysfunctional family dynamics, narcissistic parenting, toxic romantic entanglement, personal entitlement, and cognitive distortions, like overanalyzing or harboring unrealistic expectations. While these clinical dimensions are undeniably valid and require sophisticated therapeutic interventions, treating them in isolation creates a profound systemic blind spot. By shrinking the definition of mental health to a purely personal or familial matter, the psychological establishment frequently pathologizes what is in reality a rational response to structural violence. We are encouraged to meditate away our panic reframe, our panic, reframe our despair, and medicate our chronic stress, or the structural agents producing the stress remain entirely unexamined. true mental health awareness demands we look upward and outward to the macro level. We must critically analyze how institutional power, wielded through economic, policy, military force, judicial maneuvering, constitutional manipulation, shapes the collective psyche of the population. Nowhere is this paradigm shift more urgent than in contemporary Kenya. Today, millions of Kenyans are trapped in a state of chronic psychological siege, not because of inherent biochemical imbalances or personal resilience failures, but because of a barrage of state-sanctioned macroeconomic stressors. The introduction of aggressive tax regimes like the housing levy, exorbitant fuel prices, the sudden demolition of informal markets, soaring loan rate interests, the systematic rollback of subsidies in education and healthcare are not merely data points on financial ledgers. They are acute psychological stressors that inflict deep collective trauma, manifesting as widespread anxiety, clinical depression, and generation despairs, as well as acts of suicide. When state power is used to marginalize, control, oppress, and deny citizens their fundamental rights, mental health advocacy can no longer remain politically neutral. It cannot limit itself to the therapeutic couch. Social workers, psychiatrists, counselors, and civil society advocates must expand their mandate from passive clinical healing to active systemic resistance. They must advocate for the worker, the market trader, the small farmer, and the vulnerable household. These explorations deconstruct the limits of individualistic psychology, maps the profound mental toll of Kenya's current socioeconomic crisis, and provides a blueprint for macro-level approach to mental health and human dignity. The limitations of micro and meso frameworks. For decades, the dominant discourse in mental health has been built upon the biopsychosocial model. Yet in practice, the social component is routinely minimized instead. Therapeutic interventions lean heavily on individual cognitive restructuring and interpersonal diplomacy. While these frameworks provide essential relief for personal suffering, they risk turning into tools of systemic gaslighting when applied to structural oppression. Micro-level pathologizing the individual. At the micro level, mental health is treated as an internal, self-contained phenomenon Clinical frameworks focus on neurotransmitters regulation, genetic predisposition, and subjective cognitive distortion. The booming self-help industry and mainstream clinical practices emphasize concepts such taking things too seriously or overinterpreting minor setbacks, reading too much into things, which reframes systemic patterns of exclusion or workplace hostility as personal paranoia or cognitive distortion, e.g. catastrophizing, dreaming beyond expectation, where individuals are told their depression stems from unrealistic ambitions or an inability to practice contentment within their current material limitations. When an individual presents with the symptoms of generalized anxiety or vegetative depression, the standard therapeutic response is to audit their patterns through modalities like cognitive behavior therapy. Clients are taught to identify automatic negative thoughts and replace them with balanced, rational alternatives. However, even if an individual is anxious because their salary is systematically devalued by predatory taxation, or if they are depressed because they face imminent eviction, their thoughts are not distorted. They are entirely accurate reflections of a hostile reality. By treating these responses as internal pathologies, their micro-framework inadvertently shifts the burden of structural failure onto the shoulders of the victim. The message is clear. The system is not broken. Your coping mechanisms are. The meso level, the family and immediate social circle. When psychology expands its view beyond the individual, it typically stops at the meso level, the nuclear family, the workplace, the immediate romantic relationships. Current psychological discourse is saturated with the terminology addressing this dynamic. Narcissistic parenting, deconstructing how parental validation deficits and emotional manipulation fracture a child's developing self-esteem. Toxic relationships, analyzing codependency, gaslighting, and emotional abuse between partners, entitlement and interpersonal conflict, exploring how individual behavior disrupts pattern of social cohesion. Undeniably, domestic trauma is a potential driver of long-term mental illness. Adverse child experiences fundamentally alter brain architecture and stress-related system. Yet, even these meso-level dynamics do not occur in a vacuum. A narcissist or abusive parent is often himself a deeply traumatized individual operating under severe socioeconomic pressure within an oppressive societal framework. When a household is starved of economic security, plagued by systemic unemployment and denied basic public services, domestic tension skyrockets. Spousal abuse, parental neglect, and substance dependency frequently serve as maladaptive pressure values for structural frustration. By isolating the family unit from the broader political economy, meso-level analysis treats the same symptoms of societal decay as if they were isolated instances of personal, moral, or psychological failure. In recent years, the concept of resilience has been elevated to a supreme psychological virtue. Individuals are bombarded with literature urging them to cultivate grit, mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and radical acceptance. While resilience is a valuable personal attribute for navigating the unpredictable nature of human life, its systemic weaponization is deeply insidious. When governing structures and economic elites demand that citizens show resilience in the face of manufactured poverty and state neglect, resilience becomes an instrument of compliance. It reaffirms endurance as a moral duty while absolving those in power of their responsibility to govern justly. A mental health paradigm that teaches oppressed people how to quietly endure oppression without questioning the forces driving that oppression functions less as a pathway to liberation and more as an ideological sedative. Deconstructing major mental health and substance disorders. To understand how macroeconomic policy infect human psychology, we must first establish a rigorous understanding of the major clinical disorders that mental health awareness campaigns seek to address. These conditions are not abstract diagnostic categories. They are deeply felt, embodied experiences that interact dynamically with environmental factors. Diagnostic matrix of major psychological condition, mood affective disorders, major depressive disorders, MDD, bipolar spectrum disorders, 1 and 2, psychotic spectrum disorders, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, personality dynamics, borderline, narcissist, antisocial disorders, neurotic, and stress response states, generalized anxiety disorder, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Depression and anxiety, the twin plagues of chronic stress. Major depressive disorder, MDD, and generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, are the most prevalent mental health challenges globally. Depression is characterized by persistent feeling of sadness, the inability to feel pleasure, lethargy, cognitive slowing, feelings of worthlessness, and in severe cases, suicidal ideation. Clinically, it involves dysregulation of monoamine neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, and a blunted neuroplastic response in the hippocampus. Anxiety. Anxiety manifests as a pervasive and controllable worry, hypervigilance, muscle tension, gastrointestinal distress, and sleep disturbances. It represents chronically overactive sympathetic nervous system and an enlarged hypersensitive amygdala that perceives threat everywhere. All these conditions have clear biological substrates. Their expression is profoundly accelerated by environmental instability. When an individual faces chronic financial precarity, their brain is bathed in high levels of cortisol and adrenaline over months or years. The prolonged biological stress response down regulates immune function. Disrupts neurogenesis and locks the individual into permanent state of survival mode, which ultimately manifests as clinical anxiety and depressive exhaustion. Bipolar and schizophrenia, severe endogenous psychopathology. Unlike situational depression, conditions like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia possess highly pronounced genetic and neurodevelopmental components. Bipolar 1 and 2 involves severe shifts in mood, energy, and activity levels, oscillating between the terrifying highs of mania or hypomania, characterized by grandiosity, racing thoughts, reckless behavior, and decreased need for sleep, and the crashing lows of major depression. Schizophrenia is a profound neurodevelopmental disorder marked by a fragmentation of processes. It presents with positive symptoms, auditory and visual hallucination, delusions, or persecutions or grada, disorganized speech and negative symptoms, flattened affect, avolition, and social withdrawal. Even though these disorders have deep biological roots, their prognosis, relapse, rates, and severity are dictated by external environment. A person with a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia may live a stable, functional life in a low-stress environment with strong social safety nets and accessible health care. However, strip away these safety nets, subject them to police harassment, economic displacement, and community instability, and their vulnerability transforms into acute florid psychosis. Macrorephor failures do not necessarily cause schizophrenia, but they strip away the protective scaffolding that keeps vulnerable individuals alive and stable. Personality disorder, the fractured self. Personality disorders represent deeply ingrained, inflexible, and maladaptive patterns of perceiving, thinking, and relating oneself and the world, usually characterized by early adulthood. Borderline personality disorder, marked by intense emotional dysregulation, chronic feelings of emptiness, unstable sense of self, and frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Narcissistic personality disorder, characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, an insatiable need for admiration, and a profound lack of empathy for others. Antisocial personality disorder, defined by a flagrant disregard for the rights of others, decisiveness, impulsivity, and lack of remorse. These disorders are rooted in development trauma and failure of early attachment systems, meso-level disruptions. However, their prevalence and expression are deeply tied to cultural macroeconomic incentive. A society that rewards hyper-individualism, ruthless competition, exploitation often fosters narcissistic and antisocial traits within its corporate and political leadership, normalizing predatory behaviors that cause widespread psychological harm to the general population. So what we have done so far is to identify the major psychological distresses that individuals suffer and how they are related to macroeconomic policies, social justice, politics, and injustices. In the next video that I'll work on, we shall work on substance use disorders, the chemistry of maladaptive coping. So I'll conclude by saying that knowledge is beyond strength. Let's seek knowledge about mental health disorders. They are with us, and we must understand how we can live with them. Thank you very much for listening to me.